Alright, now that we have that 80s intro of the way, welcome back! Today I will be doing simulated engine failure practice for the first time in Gulf Uniform Victor Hotel. The practice is long overdue and it's really important to do, especially since I have not tried to do this in a Cessna 150. So we'll be looking over 1 forced approach during cruise, 2 in the circuit for runway 13 at Edenvale, and lastly 1 for runway 31 in slightly gustier conditions. And for those who are joining who are not aware of what forced approach practice is, it is a flight exercise where pilots will train for unexpected engine failures during flight. An engine failure can happen during any phase of flight, but for today I will be practicing only in cruise and at circuit altitude in the circuit. During such an emergency, there are a number of procedures to follow and have committed to memory. And since I'm not a certified flight instructor and have no business teaching anyone anything, I won't do a deep dive into how to execute a forced approach. We're only going to touch on the topic at a high level. The flight training manual suggests 2 types of organized approaches. The first one is a forced landing circuit pattern, and the second is a 360 forced pattern. In the 360 pattern, you aim to fly over your intended touchdown point at about 1,400 feet above ground level, also known as the high key point. Once over, you'll execute a rate 1 turn to the left, and while you're executing that turn, you will be picking out a low key point and a final key point. You'll want to be about 800 feet above ground for the low key point, and 500 feet above ground for the final key point. These points are a guide to help a pilot ensure they are on track to make the touchdown point. As far as I'm aware, they do not need to be followed 100%, but are a great reference in a time of high pressure for the pilot. Pilots should use good judgment and adjust to the conditions that they are in. As for location for practice, I've been asking several pilots where the practice area is around this airport. And there seems to be a consensus on the area that it's just north of a little lake called Orr Lake. I did find that kind of surprising as it is very close to Midland Airport as well as Lake Simcoe Airport, and there's often traffic transiting the area between Collingwood and Muskoka. But with all that being said, let's get into it.
Midland traffic, Cessna 150, Gulf Uniform Victor Hotel, currently 3,500, 1 mile north of Orr Lake. We'll be practicing lower airwork simulated engine failures in the area.
Midland traffic, Tango Alpha Mike is clear the active runway.
Turbulent, let's meet down the runway 13 for full stop.
Final traffic, Gulf Yankee Charlie Sierra, turning final runway 13 full stop.
Calling with traffic, Mike Oscar's now 10 to the
Alright,
south.
we're locked,
At
that's around
4,000
dish on both Kirby, mixed ridge, tanks level, temperatures and pressures good. ELT on 7700, Mayday, 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 Gulf Uniform Victor Hotel, Gulf Uniform Victor Hotel, Gulf Uniform Victor Hotel. Currently experiencing full engine failure. 1 soul on board, 3 hours fuel. About 2 miles north of Orr Lake. We'll be putting in a field north of Orr Lake. Gulf Uniform Victor Hotel. Okay, not to worry, we've experienced a full engine failure. We got plenty of field all around, but what I'm going to get you to do is put your phone in your pocket, move your seat all the way back, and when I tell you, open the door as discussed on the ground briefing. I'm going to put the plane down in the field over here.
Now you may be wondering why I applied power every so often during this exercise, and that's because we want to make sure the engine doesn't get shock cooled. So every 500 feet on the altimeter, we will bring the throttle up into the green for about a second and then pull it back. This is to ensure that the engine doesn't get shock cooled, so when we do our go around, we're not damaging the engine. Okay, so now that I picked out my field, notice that my field is in front of another long clear field. So why didn't I choose to land there? Well, it's hard to see from the camera, but the longer beige field is actually a hill with a bunch of valleys in it, so it's not the greatest for landing. Also, aiming for the darker field allowed me more time to lose my altitude, and having that yellow field in front of it ensured that there are few or no obstacles to worry about. Okay, so how did I do? Well, for starters, I was quite high above my high key point. I was about 2,300 above ground level at the high key point, a whole 900 feet above the recommended 1,400 feet. I believe this is fine, but it'll be slightly more work to lose the altitude. Personally, I'd prefer to be on the high side so I have more buffer to correct for misjudgments in my glide, or perhaps a strong headwind. Because I had the excess altitude, I opted to modify my approach and extend slightly to give the aircraft more time to lose altitude. You may have noticed that the approach morphed into something which looks closer to a pattern approach rather than a 360. As you can see on my on-screen checklist, I missed a few steps. So number 1, determining the wind direction. Landing downwind over a field could put you into a lot of trouble, especially if the surface is not prepared for landing. You want to make sure you have as little speed as possible when settling down. Number 2, checking the restraints and ensuring the passenger restraints are tight. I would hate to forget this step and have my head hit the panel or glare shield. There are a few stories out there where a pilot and or passenger survives the landing, but is knocked out and does not survive because they could not vacate a burning or sinking aircraft. And number 3, securing the engine. Of course, we do not want to cut the fuel, throttle, and ignition during practice, but it should be at least called out. Opening the door, number 4. I did not pretend to open the door or instruct my passenger to open the door before touchdown. Again, this can cause the occupants to get stuck in an aircraft after a crash, as the aircraft may bend and opening the doors may be impossible. Number 5. Overshot too early. Although it looked like I may have been too low or on a proper glide slope to make the field, I was actually too high. I was about 1,000 feet above ground level at the time of overshooting, and legally I'm allowed to get as low as 500. However, there was a lot of radio chatter and aircraft were departing midland in my direction, so I overshot a little early as I was worried about potential aircraft conflicts. During the simulated emergency, I do believe it is important to rehearse your radio calls and passenger briefing as you do this. Having that muscle memory in that area of what you're going to say will be very helpful and less distracting during a real emergency. You don't want to be distracted by forming what you're going to tell your passengers or ATC while paying attention to try to make the field. Okay, so that was the in-cruise forced landing practice. Let's move on to the in-circuit practice, or in pattern for our American friends.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel will be currently in the downwind. We'll be practicing simulated engine failure 13 full stop.
You'll need to forgive me for the lack of camera angles on these, as my in-cockpit GoPro died before returning to the field.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, practicing simulated engine failure 13. Edenvale traffic, Cessna 150, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, turning final simulated engine failure 13 full stop.
Edenvale traffic, Charlie November, Foxtrot Oscar 10 to the west, inbound, crossing overhead, joining in left downwind for 13.
Not bad, not great. I mean, if I slipped it a little more or less, I probably would have been okay. 40 flaps, you really gotta know when to commit to those things. Okay.
So I consider this attempt a fail, as I had to add power on short final to slow my descent. I added 40 flaps just a bit too early and lost too much altitude. I was descending rapidly and my speed was dropping. Rather than slamming my poor plane down, I aborted the exercise and added power. A major difference between the Cessna 172 and the 150 is that you really need to be sure you can commit to 40 flaps when setting them. And here we are with the second attempt. Again, same runway, runway 13. I will be pulling the power once a beam of the threshold.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel is currently in mid-downwind for 13. We'll be practicing simulated engine failure once a beam of the threshold.
As soon as I lose power, I pitch for best glide speed, which is 60 knots in the 150, and trim so that I don't have to worry about chasing the speed, and get my eyes on that runway.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, stop currently doing simulated engine failure for 13. Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, final 13 simulated engine failure.
I like to cut in a bit closer so I have excess altitude to burn off, which I burn off with an aggressive forward slip. It is hard to see the slip in the side camera angle, but if you look at the camera pointing at me, the horizon in the rear looks like I'm in a turn.
Edenvale traffic, Tango Rome XA coming up overhead at 2200, though descent on the north side of the field. Turn back and join mid-left downwind for runway 31.
Oh boy, that was something. Wish I had a front face of camera for that.
Now on to the third and final attempt. The previous attempts were under relatively benign conditions with little or no wind, and the day's thermals weren't out yet.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, currently on the downwind for 31. We'll be performing a simulated engine failure. We'll be pulling the throttle once a beam the threshold.
For this third attempt, the winds have changed direction and were quite variable, and there was a bit more turbulence as well.
Heartbeat on. Trim for best speed. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Golf Uniform Victor Hotel. Currently experiencing full engine failure. Coming in 3-1.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, executing simulated engine failure, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, 3-1.
Adding to the psychological fear factor, the end of this approach has a lot more trees, pits, and a small pond before the runway. Even though this was an exercise, I have to admit these factors up the fear factor just a little bit. As I turned base for this attempt, the thought in my mind occurred that I was not going to make it, almost as if resignation kicked in and I nearly aborted the exercise. This is probably the first time I've had this thought during any practice, and it was an interesting discovery. I then reminded myself that I had to fly the plane as if I did not have the option. Of course, within reason. If I wasn't going to make it, I'm going to abort anyway. Thankfully I did, as I managed to get this aircraft on the ground with excess altitude to deal with.
Oh, that's a skid.
Edenvale traffic, Golf Uniform Victor Hotel, clear of 3-1 at Delta.
Oh, that was freaky. I didn't think I was gonna make that. I skidded instead of slip because I wanted to slip into the wind. I fell for the classic trick that you hear about when people are trying to extend their glide. Is I was keeping my nose up even though I had altitude to kill, because I was in a slip, therefore I had to kill altitude, but I was trying to extend, doing that stupid psychological thing, Luckily, I glanced at my airspeed to know to put the nose down. You lose a lot of speed as soon as you hit 40 flaps in this plane. It's like nearly a dead stop. You gotta be really, really mindful when you're using 40 flaps on a Cessna 150.
Although this was a successful attempt, there are a few mistakes that could have ended poorly. Number 1, as I mentioned before, resignation crept into my thoughts. Thankfully, I shook this out with reason and continued with the exercise, but again, I do state, if I knew I wasn't going to make it, I would definitely abort and go around. Number 2, my attempt to enter a forward slip to the right ended up being a skid. Thankfully, I caught this with little delay, but even during an exercise, this could have caused a lot of trouble. Altitude and speeds are low at this point, at this phase in flight, and skidding here could end in a stall or spin. Number 3, although post-landing I did mention that I almost let my speed get too low, after reviewing the airspeed indicator during the entire approach, I did not let my speed get below best glide, or 50, until I was over the runway. Not exactly a mistake here, but it is neat to review your actions with video after the fact, which is why we're here watching today. I want to thank you for joining me in my flying adventures and making it this far into the video. I hope this video is entertaining and enjoyable for you. Please feel free to comment if you feel comfortable, share your stories of forced approach practice or any real emergencies and any lessons you've learned. And if you'd like to help me out, clicking the like button gives me a nice jolt of happiness. See you in the next one, and thank you for watching.